uh, as to talk about the seminar and introduce our keynote speaker.
Right. Thank you very much, Barbara. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor James Purpura. Can you ever do that? Present James. So he's a professor emeritus at Teachers College, Columbia University, of course, in New York. He wrote all his life on assessment. He was previously a grammarian and became a world star writing about learning-oriented assessment, scenario-based language assessment. He published so many books, like the Lyle-Bachman collection. He was co-editor, Principled Approach to Language Assessment, Considerations for the U.S. Foreign Service Institute, Assessing Grammar, CUP, etc., etc. He was also the president of the International Language Testing Association and an expert consultant for the European Association of Language Testing and Assessment. He was editor of Language Assessment Quarterly, a founding co-editor of Language Assessment at ETS Innovation and Validation, Routledge. He served on the Committee of Examiners at ETS for several years. He also served on the National Academy of Science Committee on the Foreign Language Assessment for the U.S. Foreign Service Institute. And of course, he remains director of Teacher College's Scenario-Based Assessment Lab. Jim, of course, this is interesting for all of us because we, of course, are mainly European. So he began his career teaching French in the US and English as a second foreign language in the US, France, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Spain, etc. He was also on the CLES scientific committee for a certain number of years, and he led us to extremely inspiring innovations in the process. In a few minutes, he will talk to us about, of course, using a learning-oriented language assessment approach to measure the 21st century language competencies by means of scenarios. Jim, it is my great pleasure to say to you now that the floor is yours.
Hey, Laurent, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to this webinar. They've scared me because they told me there are so many participants. So normally I'm not nervous doing these things. So now I'm a bit nervous. Thank you very much, Laurent. Anyway, I just wanted to thank the committee for inviting me and Laurent for facilitating this. I'm always happy to speak to my colleagues in Europe. All of that stuff that Laurent mentioned, basically I'm just a language teacher in the end. I got interested in other things, but in my heart, I'm a language learner and a language teacher. So that's why you see in the title, Learning-Oriented Assessment. I'm really interested in learning. I'm interested in learning, in order to be able to do something in the world, really the competencies we have. And I'm interested now, I've gotten interested in the way to use that was through scenarios. And so I'm kind of humbled that there are so many people that are interested now in scenario-based assessment. So I hope that I live up to your expectations here. Before I begin, I want to thank my Teachers College and also an anonymous donor who's been incredibly generous to help us with to fund the Scenario-Based Assessment Lab. Without their funding, we would never have been able to accomplish any of this stuff. So I want to thank them. I also need to thank my collaborators. I have many, but the ones on this paper today, Sue and Jorge and Dan, they have been amazing over the years. They're a part of the lab. There are many other people in the lab whose pictures are not here, but they deserve a thanks, as well as our collaborators abroad, like our friends at the University at Unistrassi in Siena, or our colleagues in Cairo, and etc. Anyway, so today the goal is to present you with really an awareness and overall introduction to the design of scenario-based language assessment, both in large scale and in classroom contexts. I wanted to do both of those because it's important. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to first discuss the high-level stuff, like the 4 domains. I'll talk about 4 domains in which we use second foreign languages to achieve basically goals that embody these competencies, competencies like the ability to collaborate or the ability to make a joint presentation. These contexts really drive the kinds of resources, especially linguistic resources, that we need in order to be able to communicate successfully in these domains. Then I'm going to go on and I'm going to describe how this event, collaborative problem solving, is really complex. We do it all day long. And I'm going to highlight the factors that come into play when we engage naturally in this activity. So this scenario will be used really to introduce the whole learning-oriented assessment framework if you're not familiar with that. Can you guys see me? Am I looking? Now you can see. So is this better? The front view, Laurent? So if I do that, let me see if I can do that. Just download this right here. Okay. And then, okay, after that, then I need to define learning-oriented assessment, scenario-based assessment, and I'll describe its key features. And then I'll use an example to exemplify that. And then finally, I'll illustrate how you can reimagine, your traditional classroom assessment tests as learning-oriented and scenario-based assessment. So okay, let me just do this here. I want to see you guys as I'm doing this, but if I do this, Laurent, am I still looking forward here or am I looking to the side?
Yes, I think there's no problem.
Okay, great. Okay, because on my screen, I'm using 3 screens here. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so let's go to the first piece here and talk about, measuring language that we need in order to be able to do things in the real world. So, you guys all know that over the years, the sociocultural, political, technological forces in what we do on a daily basis have really changed the kinds of competencies that we need to do our work in the real world. Things like have gainful employment, the pursuit of health and education, health, all these things. But one of the top 10 competencies that's consistently appearing in these lists of competencies is collaborative problem solving. Okay, so what is collaborative problem solving? So it's basically the capacity of an individual to effectively engage in a process whereby 2 or more agents, people, attempt to solve a problem, and they do this by sharing the understanding and effort required in order to come to a solution to that problem. They pool their knowledge and skills and efforts in order to be able to reach the solution. We do this all day long, every day. In other words, we work with other people, we bring our collective resources together, and then we have some kind of an achievement, okay? And that's what collaborative problem solving is. So if you look at these 3 images here, you see 3 contexts here, and you can just imagine the kinds of things that they're doing in these images. So one is a social interpersonal domain of second foreign language use, and you can imagine the things that they would talk about. The other one is and the problems they're solving there, okay? And then there's another domain of something being transacted in a social context. And then the last one is, an academic and professional domain. And once again, people are working together in order to be able to do this. So when you think about these domains, you think, well, what contexts and situations and scenarios are happening in them? What topics, themes, and tasks are being done? What are the overarching competencies that people need in order to do this? What are the foundational resources that are needed? Things like linguistic resources and topical resources, sociocultural, etc. And in all of these instances here, there is a collaboration between 2 or more people in order to be able to achieve something in the end. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do here. Okay, in this kind of assessment. So just a little more specific. Here's some examples of, competencies within the real world domain of second foreign language use. So one is social interpersonal. And in this case, the competency might be to establish, maintain, and nourish relationships. That's what we're trying to get out of here. Or we have, a social transactional domain. We're trying to carry out routine transactions in person, online, banking, things that we do every day. And the language that goes along with these different domains, the registers that go along with, they change, right? Obviously, they change. One is very informal. The second one is a little bit more formal. This one gets much more formal in, the academic or professional, the academic domain, where in this domain, very close to what you guys do every day at work, where people need to read, listen, synthesize information, learn from various sources. They share these ideas with others, or they just need to be educated, need to be informed. Okay, so these are some other types of things. And then the final domain that I put in here is the professional or the occupational domain. A little bit different from the academic, where you're going to process and evaluate information, use it maybe to reason, to solve the problems at work, and then to carry out the duties, basically carry out your duties at work. And in all of these domains, the method in order to solve these problems is through collaborative problem solving. So you can see how pervasive that is in what we do, okay? So in my view, second and foreign language proficiency is always tied to a sociocultural context in which we communicate. And the starting point for me reflects the belief that humans are constantly maneuvering situations that require goal-oriented, meaning-focused actions. And to successfully perform these actions, we need language and topic, okay? So ESP knows all about this. I mean, you've done this forever. And, EMI, these are just, this resonates very well with CLIL, and this kind of thing. But that alone is not enough in my view, okay? Having language and topical resources, we also need to be able to marshal these resources along with cognitive, contextual, and dispositional resources, things like engagement, to solve simple and complex problems alone or in collaboration with others. In other words, we need the capacity to develop and deploy a wide range of competencies so we can use these competencies flexibly across a range of contexts. Okay, so this is where we're going. This is what we're trying to do with scenario-based assessment. The method for doing this, there are many methods. The method that I'm going to talk to you about today is through the use of scenarios, through problem-solving scenarios. So a scenario, let me just define this. It's a description of an internally consistent set of naturally occurring imagined scenes or events in which characters carry out actions and interact with each other until they bring that scenario goal to a resolution. This will become clearer a little bit later what we mean by this, but it's basically going through steps to solve a problem. So these scenarios are proxies, basically, substitutes for real life situations in which they can be used to create a context in which the examinees have to use their mental, social, and our dispositional resources, dispositional things like emotion, stuff like that, anxiety, to perform these tasks to achieve this goal here. I love scenarios. They're naturally flexible in that they can present straightforward, simple scripts with very few complications, or they can be manipulated to present storylines with surprising features, such as novel insights, shifts in values or perspectives, actionable feedback, and so forth. You can really throw something into the scenario and change the way the storyline is going. Similar to real life context, just about anything can be modeled to create a dynamic scenario. Okay. All right. So the gold standard, as far as I'm concerned, is to explore the possibility of creating and delivering complex computer-delivered assessments capable of measuring an examinee's ability to use his or her second foreign language proficiency, along with all these other resources, to solve a problem collaboratively. And since we're doing this not face-to-face, but we want to give computer-based tests, okay, so we can be consistent. There are a lot of reasons why we do this. We do this with an imaginary group of peers online. throughout the course of the assessment. So what happens is you're introduced to a group, your peers, there's a group leader, and then you're going to go through a whole series of steps that you're going to be, you'll solve the problems together, and each of these turns into different tasks. Okay. So unlike the traditional skill-based assessments that we all know about, okay, these assessments are engineered, scenario-based assessments are engineered, and I'm using that word specifically, engineered, to measure second foreign language proficiency that's situated within a social cultural context of second foreign language use. Okay, so what's complex about this, what's interesting about this also, is that many tests provide people with a context. Okay, now you're at the store and you're going to solve this problem. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about you are in the store. Here's your goal in the store. You're going to work with this kind of person. That kind of person has New York City attitude, so you're going to have to deal with it. And then you're going to try to get this problem solved because there might be an issue. Okay, so that's the kind of sociocultural context. So where the ability to accomplish this is through a sequence of simple and complex tasks, often over time, and it's embedded in the mediated engagements of social and interactional practices of a particular community. So this is where the whole discourse pragmatics piece is super important in this type of an assessment. All right, so let's give you an example, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example of an everyday problem-solving scenario. The culminating goal for this scenario is to make a decision about a vacation destination based on online research and our own personal preferences. Okay, so you're going to go on vacation with someone. Okay, and so I just want to show you how complex this activity is. Just you are trying to plan a vacation with your partner, your kids, your friends, however you're going to do it, and this is not really all that easy. Okay, so what are the complexities of doing this? And I'm going to take you through the complexities of this and how we can analyze this through the lens of learning-oriented assessment. Okay, so let me introduce you to my really, really close friend, Alfred. He's Catalan. He was just back in my house for a week last week. And Alfred is the best traveler you can ever imagine. He's fantastic. We've traveled to all kinds of places, and he does his homework. He pushes back when I get too bossy, and he's just fantastic. Okay, so after the pandemic, we decided we wanted to treat ourselves to a vacation, and he wanted to go to a luxury resort in Cancun. And I've been there, done that. Went to a wedding, not interested. And I wanted to go back to Istanbul because I just love that city. It's a cultural explosion. The food is fantastic, and I just want to go back to Istanbul. Okay, so we had to work this out because he saw like an ad for cheap vacations. Okay, not that we need to have cheap vacations, but it was a good deal. All right. So contextually, this is the context, right? We got these two things. So what was actually in this vacation scenario? So the topic of conversation, of communication here was vacations. Real life communication goal was for me to persuade my friend to go to Istanbul and vice versa, to go to Cancun. So it was a friend-to-friend interaction. So the registers were informal. And the goal here, one of the goals was to make travel decisions, but also the goal with Alfred is also socializing. So the primary goal is transactional, but there's also an interpersonal part of this. So in the scenario itself, there were several online meetings, Zoom, text, WhatsApp, you name it. And this was the social interactional domain of language use. And the real world competencies needed by me as a foreign language speaker of Spanish and Catalan was the ability to use Spanish and Catalan to learn about a destination online, read the ads and things like that, and then learn about another destination from Alfred. And then for me to persuade Alfred to go to my preferred destination, he's going to persuade me to go to his. So you get the idea here. We've all been through this. And so these are some test design considerations for engineering this. You start right here. Okay. So when you think of the contextual dimension of this, you think of the sociocultural context, you think of the real world topics, scenarios, tasks, and competencies that you need. And then if you're given this as a test, you need to think of the institutional context as well. What is this being used for? Is it a placement test? Is it an achievement test, et cetera? There are other pieces in the contextual dimension here. Then we have, how do we get language out of people? We elicit language here. And so basically what we use here in order to do this is called a scenario narrative. This is basically the habits of mind that we use in order to solve problems. And this also is, according to Dean and them, this is called a build and share literary practice. And let me show you why, okay? And so this is the theoretical model we're using here. So what happened first is Alfred shares an ad for a low-cost customizable vacation package to Mexico, Cancun, Cairo, all these different places, right? So this is actually, a performance indicator for me because I have to read the ad, and the ad was in Spanish, okay? And then we both got together and we discussed the two different destinations, and we disagreed. Okay, so this kind of like brainstorming initial conversation is an enabling skill. It happened through speaking, but this is initially how we. So that's step number 2 in the task. Step number 3 then would be we each decide to research a destination on our own online, and then we came back to summarize the takeaways in an email. We sent each other things in an email. Okay, so this is a performance indicator. For me, it's integrated reading, listening, because I listen to stuff too, and then writing about it in an email to him. So this could be scored, right? These performance indicators could all be scored. And then we each use that information in order to convince each other in video recorded text messages. So I think we should do this, blah, 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 and okay, well, I want to think you do that. So these are performance indicators for me because I needed to record, a video recorded message to him. Okay, so this is speaking. This is speaking here. This could be scored also. And then we came back together, and Alfred's emails tried to convince. Alfred emailed me and said, okay, we'll go to Istanbul. I know you've been to Cancun. So his email was to concede, but he asked me to make some trip adjustments. Okay. So what I did was I said, okay, thank you. That for him, that was a performance indicator. That for me, to actually write the email. But for me, I had to read the email for this. That was a performance indicator. Did I understand his message? And then I offered to write a detailed email to the agency reflecting our collective wishes. So for me, again, that was the culminating competency, and it involved writing. So on the right-hand side, you can see all the different tasks that you have here. And so this is what's called the scenario narrative. And each of these tasks can be scored independently. So when you think of elicitation, you think of what is the blueprint, what is of the test, what's the scenario narrative, what is the sequence of tasks, and that all involves test specifications, item development, online authorship, online assembly, delivery, all that you think of when you think of an assessment. That's this right here. Okay, item management, tracking, scoring, score reports, all of that comes under elicitation. I will talk more about that later. The third dimension here of this scenario is obviously the proficiency dimension. We need linguistic and topical resources. So we both had to have a range of language and topical resources to solve this problem. So this is the language piece in all of this, okay? And in this piece, I needed to have, and Alfred needed to have, sometimes he spoke English to me, so he needed to have this too. We both needed basically the semantic grammatical resources, grammar and vocabulary and things like that. But we also needed to have topical resources. We needed to have information, propositional content. We needed to be polite to each other and do this we disagreed, so we needed to do this in a way that was pragmatically appropriate. And we needed to get things done. We needed to persuade each other, the functional resources here. So this is kind of, when we think of language, this is a linguistic resource. And we're using an article that I wrote about meaning-oriented model of second language proficiency in order to drive this theoretically. We also needed reading and listening comprehension skills, where we understand both the literal and implied meanings of visual and audio text. We needed speaking and writing skills. We need to have linguistic control, all these things we think about when we speak or we write. And then the construct here that we're talking about is really integrated content and language knowledge, or more broadly, not second and foreign language proficiency, but situated second foreign language proficiency, because it's so tied to this particular context. And and I'm going to show you a little bit later how we operationalize and to make it situated. Okay. All right. So when we think of proficiency dimension, we think of the linguistic and topical resources. We think of things like performance standards, the CEFR, all of that, learning progressions, things like that. Okay. Look, in this context here, though, Alfred and I read websites for information. We presented each other with these takeaways. Sometimes we helped each other with language and content and corrective feedback. That's not the correct word, things like that. There could have been an informal language lesson. That would not be abnormal. If I was speaking Catalan, my Spanish is much better than my Catalan. And there's a conveyance of new information here was really fundamental to this. So for those who are interested in ESP or CLIL, this piece here is instructional, and we do this all day long. We learn from each other. Okay. In most tests, people pretend this doesn't exist. In a scenario-based assessment using the learning-oriented framework, this is a critical piece of the framework. Okay. So when we talk about this instructional dimension, we're talking about information that we get in the reading, the listening. It's information as instructional. These inputs we get from various sources that help us build a mental model of what are these two vacation things. Okay. When we also, the instructional dimension is when we give people assistance, maybe with a vocabulary word or with a graphic or something like that, we're providing accommodations, again, to help them build that mental model that they're trying to do. But so assistance is instructional. Sometimes we give people feedback in these. This is how you do this in Catalan, or this is the word you want to say in Spanish. There's corrective feedback. For me, that is a test taker. That is instructional. And we do this when we're speaking to internationally. We do this all day long when talking to people, depending on your linguistic, your proficiency level. So feedback here is instructional, and that is an explicit part of scenario-based assessment. And also, there are some timeouts, some embedded, implicit, explicit instruction. A language lesson or a lesson about a topic or culture aimed to help build that mental model. So there might be a time when, I might have to explain to Alfred, well, in the Turkish context where I've been in many times, and there's a little lesson there. Or so there might be it could be a language lesson, it could be a topical lesson, but we teach each other all the time. Okay. And this is recognition of the fact that that exists. So there are various ways of presenting information to help build and consolidate understandings. That is part of scenario-based assessment. If I'm going to teach you something, though, you're going to need to learn something. So the opposite of this is the socio-cognitive dimension. In this case, Alfred and I had to draw on social and mental resources to process the information that we were getting. Okay. Learning is central. Okay. We then had to apply this knowledge to solve the problem. So, for example, when you and I want to go someplace, we learn something. We always learn something in every conversation that we have. Okay. Otherwise, it's called you're boring. You're aggressively boring if I have to sit there with you and you tell me things that I already know. So this is acknowledging that, people teach each other and we learn things from each other on a minute-by-minute basis when we're interacting with other people. So when we talk about learning in this context, we're talking about your attention span, very low with people right now, given technologies. We talk about remembering what they said, memory here. We are also talking about the task requires us to process information, use strategies to remember, reason, all of this mental stuff that's going on here, that we need to process a lot of information here and remember it so that we can have a conversation. And then the task required us also to consider social and cultural context to solve the problem with partners. So there is what we call, embodied cognition. There's situated cognition, distributed cognition. I'm not going to go into these pieces here, but this is part of the thinking here of how we behave, what's being accessed when we're asked to do this type of thing. It's complex. So when we think of this dimension, we think of the attention span and memory capacity. We think of processing resources like strategies that we use to understand stuff, reasoning, remembering information, and then embodied, situated, and distributed cognition. It's still even more complex. So there are 4 things right now. The next thing is we're doing this in an interactional context. We're talking to each other back and forth. So Alfred and I we've been friends for a long time. He's a lawyer, I'm a professor. We come with identities here, okay? We move between 3 or more cultures. We're aware of the sociocultural sensitivities of cross-cultural communication. We consciously engage in the interactional practices related to these languages and cultures. So we need to have this social interactional dimension activated at all time when we speak to each other. So what we mean by that is, when I'm working with anybody, there's a social contract here. I'm American and Italian, and you might be French or Czech or Catalan or wherever you're from. That brings together our identities. You might be married, not married. So we need to respect that piece in terms of our roles here, and that's going to come out in the language. We also need to understand that there are discourse or interactional practices that are norms that we have and expectations that we have. Things like topical management, turn-taking practices, sequencing practices, all of the discourse type of stuff that we got. All of this is part of this. This is all engaged in this kind of collaborative problem-solving activity. So when you think of this dimension, when you have interaction, you think, well, who are the people speaking to each other, and how are they respectful of each other in this context, and what exactly are the interactional practices that people use in this domain of language of language use? Okay. Always in this context, there is the affective dimension that's being engaged. Again, this is a dimension that in typical testing it's not explicitly mentioned. Okay, it's there. You can do an analysis of it, but this is an explicit part of this. Alfred and I oriented towards a stimulating vacation with food and fun. Okay, we were considerate of each other's wishes. We were both willing to put in the time and the effort to have the best vacation possible, so that we bring this kind of these dispositions to this kind of an activity here when you're collaborating with people. When you think about this, we think about this in terms of the psychological perceptions that we have and dispositions we bring to interacting with people. We're engaged, interested, trusting, amused, surprised, confident, and not disengaged, anxious, and feeling overwhelmed. These things all affect how we actually are able to solve this problem. Also, we think of the social dispositions and attitudes. We're cooperative and caring, appreciative, compromising, compassionate, and fair, as opposed to being entitled, arrogant, bossy, and biased. Okay. We also bring behavioral perceptions and dispositions where we both try to put in the effort, there's persistence, and not the idea of helplessness and lack of initiative and lazy. So all of these pieces here, when you're talking about collaborating with other people, there have been times where you've worked with other people and they didn't put the time in, they didn't put the effort in, they're lazy, or they were a bit arrogant, okay, or they were bossy, or do you understand what I'm saying? So all of that is being tapped into here, and this framework recognizes it. So when you think about the affective dimension, you're thinking about triggering this task, triggering the psychological, social, and behavioral dispositions and attitudes. And finally, last but not least, okay, Alfred and I needed to be able to use the internet and communicate online. I mean, I don't know how frustrated I am when I know that someone doesn't know what WhatsApp is, or how frustrated I can get when one of my family members has never been on Zoom and I want to do a Zoom thing with them. It's just easier. So we had to have the ICT here, and with this test, because the whole test is online, So when we think about that, we think about the digital literacy skills that we as academics take for granted many times. But with Alfred, he's a lawyer, so he knows all this stuff. So this was never an issue. But if you're giving a test around the world, you need to keep this in mind that you're asking them to do this online. So as a result, we have a familiarity test that I hope many of you, familiarization test, which I hope many of you took before coming here. When we talk about these skills, we talk about understanding the internet, telecommunications. We talk about ICT familiarization, computer setup, all that stuff. And then we think, when on the other hand, for the test developer, we think, technology is fully integrated into test authoring, development, delivery, administration. Our test is completely online, including online scoring, online reporting of the protocols. All the test management system is all online. So we study things like the process. We study analytics that are underneath all of this. And then we study language production, the language production analytics, obviously. And all of this is a part of the validity research. So this whole technological piece is super important. When you think about technology, you think about this dimension, you think about the ability to use information and communication technologies and have digital literacy. So that's a lot, right? That is really a lot. We take a lot of this for example, for granted. We can't take this for granted, really. So if we're going to put this into a model, a framework, okay, there are 8 dimensions that characterize, or maybe 7 dimensions. I think I got the number wrong. Let me see. How many I think there are 7 here. So the measurement people can never count without a computer. Dimensions that characterize this language use event, and then we're going to try to adapt this for a scenario-based assessment. So but one thing to consider here is learning is central. It's a central feature here. But we begin with that contextual dimension. And then we give people a task to do. So this is the scenario narrative. We need to elicit behavior, and that behavior needs to be very, very closely associated with the kind of language we want them to use and the information, the topic we want them to talk about. So these 2 things are very closely associated. When we put, asking people a question and getting their language, that whole piece there produces, when we produce, it produces performance, right? You ask them a question, you get an answer. That answer is a performance indicator. That tells you and me how well you know that, how well you're able to communicate that. We call these performance indicators, and we can score those things, okay? And when you take a traditional assessment, this is what you get. You have these 3 dimensions, some kind of a context, maybe sometimes you don't have the context, and like in an old grammar test, but you have question and answer, okay? But in this framework, it's much more complex, right? We want to engineer a social context, so we have a lot of things that moderate the performance, factors that moderate the performance. And one factor would be the instructional dimension. What kind of information we're giving people in order for them to be able to say something appropriate and smart and real. If we give them instruction, we're going to ask them to understand the kind of instruction we're going to give them, okay? We're going to ask them also to, we're going to be aware that they're going to come with affect here, that they might be nervous or they might be really engaged, okay? I mean, that's what we found, that people really love these tests. And then we can also do this, a lot of this is happening within a social context with chats and things like that. And so there's that social dimension there. And then finally, we've got the technological piece. So let me think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8 dimensions. I counted correctly. Okay. So this is the learning-oriented framework that we're talking about. This drives assessment development, and it also drives validation. So right now we're writing papers here. So one paper is associated with how you use this framework in order to develop the test. We're doing a special issue for Language Assessment Quarterly, and this is paper 2. The talk today is paper 2. Okay, paper 3 is where we get all of the validation of the performance indicators. In other words, is this test psychometrically sound? Okay, because all testers want to know that. Paper 4 looks at that affective dimension. What are the students' reactions to this kind of a test? So it's all about that. Paper 5, 6, 7 are with different languages. Paper 8 is with that technological dimension. What do we need in order to be able to do this kind of test from a technological dimension? What have we done, and what is the future? Okay, so we have a lot of papers associated with this. All right, so now that you know what the framework is that we're using, let's move on a little bit. But before I do that, let's just say LOA as a design framework. So you can use many approaches to design these scenario-based assessments. We chose this framework because it forced us to acknowledge and design for different dimensions of this event. So this includes the specification of tasks, obviously, in every test to give us these performance indicators related to the proficiency that people were trying to get at. And these are situated within some kind of sociocultural context. So this is normal testing, okay, especially task-based testing or CLIL testing. What's different about this is it also forced us to acknowledge and account for performance moderators within this event. Things like the role of the instructional role of the input. How have we controlled the input here? And then how do people process that input? And what's the role of affect in task engagement, for example? Or what are the social interactional practices of solving this problem together in the chats that we come out with? And what is the role of technology? And finally, the framework forces us to consider the synergies between all this. These are not independent things. They're all related. And so this forced us to do that. So let's look at now how this framework was used in order to design a scenario-based assessment. This sounds super complex, but it's not actually in the end. So scenario-based assessment as a technique for assessing situated second and foreign language proficiency through collaborative problem solving, okay, what we do every day. So you remember this scenario. So the overarching question here for test development is, if we use this context for assessment, how can we engineer tests to elicit situated second and foreign language proficiency in this really complex dynamic situation? And how can we do this by means of collaborative problem solving scenario? And then how can we be sure the test is a psychometrically sound measure of these performance consistencies? This is the heart and soul of assessment. Okay, so let's just say, let's stop out and let's have a lesson here. What is scenario-based assessment? Here's your formal definition. So it's a technique that's used. It's not a theory. It's a technique used to immerse examinees into a socio-cultural context in which an examinee on the right, okay, as a fully contributing member of an imaginary team online. So he's going to be looking at that computer, and there are going to be other imaginary characters that they're going to be working with, which we've programmed in there, okay, can work alone. So he can work alone, or he can work with these other people collaboratively to solve the problem, okay? The problem is contextualized within this scenario narrative. Here's the steps you need to do, okay? That's composed of a sequence of independent tasks or interrated scenes, okay? And these reflect the habits of mind that we use in order to solve a problem, okay? Many of the tasks, as you saw, serve as performance indicators, and then there are other tasks that serve as performance moderators, okay? So the scenario creates a collaborative social context in which scripted online chats, these are already scripted here with imaginary characters, they guide the examinee through various parts of the exam. And I'll show you what that means later. I'll give you an example, okay? The scripted chats are also used to provide the examinee with assistance, okay, in deconstructing the problem, figuring out strategies for solving it, and for providing topical and linguistic and emotional support. Okay, that's what these chats are for. So these chats are super important in terms of scenario-based assessment. Aside from these performance indicators, we're also tapping into tap into proficiency. The scenario is designed to tap into these performance moderators, things like, once again, the role of background knowledge, help with synthesizing information, possibly embedded instruction, feedback, other kinds of assistance, effective peer supports, and also help with the technology at times. The test The assessments are digitally delivered to capitalize on the affordances of relevant technologies. I love this, that it's digitally delivered because we can control it from an assessment perspective. If we have person to person, we cannot control the variability of the other person. But here, we want to make these people digital so that to the extent possible, it seems real, but they're controlled. Okay, that whole control piece is very important for standardized testing. Okay, so the problem resolution is embedded in a worthwhile educational experience in its own right, with, and this is super important, with the expectation that examinees will actually learn something new from the test. Okay. Other tests do not have the learning piece embedded into the test. We believe that if you're going to sit down for 2 hours and do a test, you should come out on the other end learning something new. Okay. And there's a whole bunch of resources here that we're not the first people to do this. So we've had a lot of inspiration from other people. So the challenges, though, is the ability to solve a problem collaboratively over time is a complex language use event. It implicates many dimensions of that context. To account for the different sources of variation in such a context, though, we used the LOA framework. And as I said before, we chose this framework because it made us consider both performance indicators and performance moderators. So let's move on now to the design here of a test that we actually built, okay? So in this test, the scenario goal is to make a compelling research-based argument to a committee to support the group's preferred destination for a class trip. So imagine that the teacher comes in and says, hey, we got some funding to go on a class trip, but in order to be able to do that, you need to present a proposal. Okay, a very short, 5-minute proposal, and the best proposal, the committee, an independent committee will judge, and the whole class will go to that piece there. But it needs to be educational because you need to learn something about 2 destinations, and then the committee will choose the most compelling argument for the trip, and we'll fund the entire thing. Okay, so it's gamifying it. Okay, so this is the context here, the scenario goal. So in the scenario, the examinees are they're given, in real life you'd have a teacher and maybe peers, but in this we have imagined peers, okay, and we have animated chats, okay, and the examinee will represent the group. So the simulated teacher will come in and she tells the group project. She says, our classes receive funds to go to a foreign country. In this project, you will decide X, Y, and Z. When finished, you'll send your proposal to the selection committee. They'll choose. So this sets up the whole scenario for them. And you'll work with 3 peers to research 2 destinations, try to present a compelling proposal for your preferred destination. And all of this is, you'll see chats coming in. It's all animated. All this comes in here, animated. Okay. And then, then they introduce you to other people who you're working with online. Okay, it's a computer simulated selection committee, and that's the committee you need to present this to. All right, so this happens, and then they send their proposal to that committee. Okay, and the committee will decide. So how do we structure this? So what is the scenario narrative? Basically, this is tapping into what Dean et al. Call a building and sharing literacy practice. It also is what O'Reilly calls the habits of mind of problem solving. So in our test, before we get there, we first give them a grammar test, and we make sure, because we're trying to make this test be a B1 plus test. So we want to make sure that most of the candidates are at that level, okay, or below that level, or somewhere around that level. We also have a test for, B2, we've got a test for A2, but so we give them this grammar test so we can kind of figure out, are you appropriate for that level? If they're not at the B1 level, more or less, we don't give them this test because it's probably too hard, okay? All right, so first we do that. That's not a part of the scenario-based assessment, that's just a part of our lab. Here's where we begin. We begin by giving them a background knowledge test. So we give them a pre-scenario topical knowledge test. They ask them questions about Vietnam, ask them questions about Jordan, see what they know. And they're allowed to say, I don't know anything. They're allowed to say, I don't know. At the end of this, we give them the exact same test, Now it's no longer background knowledge because we taught them something. So we give, it's a topical knowledge test. And then we calculate what did they know, what was their score in the beginning and what was the score in the end in order to have a gain score. So everybody who has taken this test has learned something new, and we have empirical evidence to show that they've learned something new in this test. That's one of the goals of scenario-based assessment. Now, how do they do that? So the first part that they go through is, we called it, or Dean and them call this a building, consolidating, and sharing knowledge piece. In this case, they're using the reading comprehension task about Vietnam to build knowledge, a mental image of what Vietnam is about. Then we ask them to categorize tasks. What are the pros and cons? And we give them feedback about their pros and cons. Once they've done that, we want them to write a summary of the pros and cons so that they can send an email, so they can write an email. But we can't assume that they know how to write that summary. So we take a timeout, we give them a very brief lesson on how to write a summary, and then we have them write that summary task. Okay, so we're scoring. We can score for topical knowledge, we can score for reading, we can score for categorization, we can score for writing a summary. We repeat this, building and sharing, consolidating, but this time we're using listening comprehension, and we're going to the next destination. In this one, the first destination was Vietnam. This destination is Jordan. They basically do the exact same thing. They listen to some videos, they categorize the pros and cons, they get feedback on the categorizations. This time we don't give them guidelines or instruction because we did that before. Okay, this time we give them the second summary writing task, and the first writing task they just talked about the pros. In this task they talk about the pros and cons in their summary. Okay, and they send that off. Next, we ask them to get together with their group and decide, which place do you want to go? Does your group want to go to? Okay, and so this is getting them prepared for the pitch that they're going to make. This is not scored. This is not scored part of the test. This is just preparation. And then finally, we have them use that information in order to put together a really good pitch. This is the speaking task. They're making the pitch. And then at the very end, they take. So this is the scenario narrative. This is how the test goes through. Now, when we look at this on the left-hand side here, these are the same things here. But in between all of this stuff here is the social interactional devices that we use. So you can see the teacher comes in, and this is the social interactional dimension here. Here the teacher is going to introduce the scenario goal. Here the peers are going to discuss, after that first one, they're going to discuss the two destinations. Here the teacher is going to give them corrective feedback. Here the teacher is going to give them an explicit lesson. Here the peers are going to look at the sample summary review and talk about it. So you see all of this is embedded. All of this moves along with chats that allow people to interact with all this, okay, to make it seem like it's natural. All right, so when we talk about the testing part of it, we have a number of different questions associated with all of these performance indicators. K is equal to the number of questions. So you see they're getting a lot of actual assessment here. So what are some special features here that we needed to do differently? One is we have a simulated teacher, which is one of the features of scenario-based assessment. And so you see there's a guide in here moving us through the test, okay, moving us through the scenario. Then we also have simulated peers, people who they're talking to, and these are chat bubbles because one person it's like you're doing a WhatsApp thing, okay? So you'll get a message, and then you'll see the person writing 3 dots, blah blah blah, blah, and then you'll get the next message come through, and then you'll see 3 dots, and someone's writing it, next message comes through. So it really seems like there are 3 people having an interactive chat here, okay? Another thing that we had to design here was this explicit instruction. So Lee basically says, I looked at how Kathy wrote her cons paragraph. It's interesting. She mentioned a con from the forum and then made a conclusion. Look at the paragraph here. So this is a model paragraph for them to look at. So this is a timeout. This is kind of an instructional piece. Okay. And then there was feedback about the pros and cons, so it just gives you corrective feedback about, no, it wasn't a con, it was a pro, etc. They get that immediately after doing that type of task. Okay, this is actually very easy to program in there. Okay. We also had to, as a feature of this, we gave them a pre-scenario topical knowledge task where, people come in with all kinds of topical knowledge before the test. In many tests, we just assume that we don't make assumption about background knowledge, right? We do make some kind of assumptions, but this is, we assume people are going to come in with background knowledge. And so, but we also want to make sure that they learn something new in the test. So some people come in with a lot of background knowledge. We try to choose topics where they didn't come in with a lot of background knowledge. And I think we're very successful at doing that. But we need to take into account the fact that there's people come in with background knowledge, especially when we're talking about CLIL or all of this, they come in with background knowledge. All right, so this is what one of the reading tasks look like. It's a performance indicator. Looks like a traditional reading. Basically, it's to measure the ability to understand literal and implied meanings in the text. And then here's what that categorization task looks like, where they have different features of there. So notice what it said here. Anna says, here's our list of pros and cons. Take a look. What do you think? Which trip should we pitch? And then these are Lee's notes based on the information in the form. And then they go through and they kind of like choose, are these pros and cons, wrong information, not related? We're trying to get at fake news here. Okay, our agenda. And that's what that task looks like. So this is a moderator, performance moderator, their ability to categorize. And this that we're trying to measure that explicitly here. And then once they categorize, then we give them, information we give them corrective feedback here. So this is feedback on categorizing the task. The purpose is to give feedback so that examinees will correct the information for which they have to write the summary, right? And so what we've done is we've looked at the analytics underneath this. How much time are they actually spending on looking at their own feedback? Okay, it's super interesting. We're not publishing on that immediately, but we're definitely analyzing it. Okay, here's an example that we had of the writing guidelines. This is so Lee says, I looked at how Kathy wrote her cons paragraph. It's interesting. She mentioned a con from the form and then made a conclusion. Look at the paragraph. So you see here how just basically state a con, make a conclusion, state a con, make a conclusion. This helps them with the rhetorical structure of the task for those people who don't know how to write this kind of paragraph. It gives them a little bit of instruction. As I said, this is an explicit instruction to write the summary, to provide people with a model text, guidelines, etc. Then we get to the part of the test where they have to write a summary. Okay. In this part of the test, it's like, we have, Anna saying, wow, it's interesting to look at how Kathy wrote the cons paragraph. And then she goes on and says, so you can write and send me the pros paragraph with an introductory sentence and a concluding sentence. Now they know that terminology because they just learned it. Okay, I'll add this to the summary and send the whole thing to the teacher. Okay, remember to write an introduction sentence and a concluding sentence, she says. Okay, so this is where the peers are helping each other with the process, as we would do in real life problem solving, right? If you're writing this with other people, that's what you would do. And then there are guidelines that we presented them with on how to write a good summary. And then they have that available to them. And then they write their actual summary in the box there. So this is a performance indicator. Obviously, it's with assistance, and the purpose is to measure to follow to write a summary following this kind of instruction. Later on in the test, after they go through the listening and all the next part, then they're given the second writing task is after the listening part. And in this part here, again, when they go to write the task, they have resources available to them. On the left-hand side, you see just lists of the pros and lists of the cons. This is to ease the memory, the things that you need to remember here, just kind of jogging your memory here from what you listened to and read about. And then they can also look at the guidelines right in front of them for how to write a good summary. And then they write that paragraph and send it off. So this is, again, a performance indicator to look at writing ability. And this time it's without the explicit instruction, whereas the first time it was with explicit instruction. Then they get to the very end and they have to make their pitch. before they do that, we try to set them up on how they're going to do that. So we give them instructions. We tell them basically how to do that. Here's Miss Paris, the teacher. She says, it's time to give your presentation now. Okay, and this is all, again, chatted out. You see animations coming in. You first tell the committee which country your group wants to visit, then explain your group's decisions using the list of pros and cons below. And when ready, click on that microphone and make your pitch. You have 2 minutes or 3 minutes or how many minutes you have to do the entire thing. So basically what we're doing here is we're trying to scaffold the whole thing to help organize the content of the pitch and to help them with the memory load so it doesn't become a total memory test. And then we give them the topic of knowledge, exact same topic of knowledge test at the end of the narrative to be able to look at learning. Okay. All right. So that's basically the test. How do we score this whole thing? Okay. So this looks daunting, but this is a model of the entire test. Okay. So you see in the beginning, there's, the whole purpose here is to make a pitch for the class, building understandings, sharing understandings, building understandings through listening, writing about them, sharing the understanding. So all of these are performance indicators. And then you get down here to other performance indicators. This is the speaking part down here. These two are the writing parts. Here's the reading part and the listening part. And so all of this together is under the construct is situated second and foreign language proficiency. Okay. I'm going to talk now more. I'm going to focus here on making the pitch, which is the competency. Okay. So, because I can't go through all of this stuff. So our theoretical model underlying speaking ability is that speaking ability consists of content. In other words, you have to have the content you have needs to be accurate. It needs to be relevant. You need to have enough information there. So it needs to be topically developed. And to a certain extent, it needs to have some sophistication depending on the type of task that you're going to do. So basically, what we're trying to get at here are the propositional resources. In CLIL, this would be called content knowledge. Okay, we've really taken it apart and decided, and we score for. We will score. We have a rubric for content quality. We have a rubric for content sufficiency, because I'll tell you, these are two different domains. They're two different pieces of information. Very important. So content, this propositional piece, is very, very important. Then we get at semantic, grammatical, and pragmatic resources that we measure here. So one, we're getting at rhetorical control. We'll give them score for that, where we define that in terms of logical development, coherence, cohesion. Obviously, the language control, where we're getting at accuracy and lexical resources and pragmatic appropriateness. We also need to get at delivery. Are they understandable, intelligible, phonologically, or how are they doing here? And then we need to get at fluency. That's another piece that we pull out, because is the rhythm and intonation, all that piece, do we understand it? In the end, basically, are we going to give them feedback on it? And then finally, we get at the very last piece, which is the goal accomplishment. Were they persuasive in their giving their pitch? So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rubrics. And these 7 rubrics will give scores to people. If we give scores to people, students will be able to learn from their scoring on the rubrics. So we're very learning oriented here. On the right-hand side here, all of this theoretically is taken from the meaning-oriented model, where propositional resources is really important. The language resources are really important, and the ability to get your job done. The competency is really important. So all of this is theoretically taken from that. All right, so what does a rubric look like? Okay, all of this is online, by the way. We love these rubrics, because basically what we do is they'll click on something, and they'll see this is a speaking rubric. They'll click on something and they'll hear the person speak. And then they'll see this rubric. They see rubric number 1. This is rubric number 2. And basically, you read the rubric. The elaboration refers to. There's a definition here, and then they just click on the piece that is important here, and then they go to the next one. Okay, and then they click on the third rubric. Just click and go to the next one. But it's all in front of you. If you need to listen to the sample again, you can listen to it again, and then you click and go to the next one. When you get to the very end, you hit submit, and then all of those all of those responses go to an Excel file, which is they're automatically collected. So it's beautiful because then you can do the analyses right from the Excel file. So this is a content responsible rubric. Now, what do we mean by content responsible rubric? So basically, during the scenario, they learned something about Jordan. They learned something about Vietnam. Here, when they get to this piece here, they can't just willy-nilly say stuff. Okay, they need to be able to say stuff that's really that's accurate within what they were given. They can use background knowledge to bring other extra things in, but they're asked to say something, to use what they heard in order to do that. So we're holding them responsible for the content. Okay. And if they just decide to go on their own tangent, they get a low score. If they decide to only report on what's in the content that we've given them, they'll get a high score. If they get a content what's in the beginning and they really elaborate it, they're going to get a really high score. Okay, they bring in their own background knowledge, because we can't penalize them for having background knowledge. We want to reward them, but it needs to be relevant. Okay, so we have had people that very few people who just completely went off topic and they gave their own content and they got low scores. Anyway, so that's that rubric. Here's a rubric on persuasiveness, where again they listen to it and then they just click. And then here's a rubric on the language piece. Notice down below here, we give the rater help with the kinds of structures they should be listening for in this particular task. So word choice and stuff like that. This is, you need to train people on using these rubrics, as you do with all rubrics. I think the most interesting piece is, so we have all these rubrics, they score them, they get numbers, and then we give them a score report. Because remember, we're really interested in learning here. And so our score report is a learning-oriented score report. Now, what do we mean by that? So in the beginning, we gave this as a placement test, right? And so what we did though, and it was in the design phase, we were just collecting data on this. We didn't really use this in real life, but we were just experimenting with this. So what we did was we gave them two types of information here. One type of information, well, first of all, we told them, what is the appropriate use of scores and what is an inappropriate use of these scores. And then we gave them, because everybody wants to have an overall, what did you get on all of these different parts of the test? So they got a score for grammar, they got a score for reading, and these are all in percentages. Notice either percentages, or if it was a rubric on a 10-point rubric, what number did they get on the rubric? So the score report, provides information about how you did on the major sections of the test. As far as I'm concerned, this is not the most interesting piece, and this was not the most interesting piece in the research that we did with the students. So this is the cover page. Okay, that's how you did. A lot of people want to have this, but we gave them task by task information on how they performed based on the construct. So in the reading task, they got information on to what extent did they understand the form, how did they categorize it, to what extent, and they got an overall reading comprehension score. And then they got some kind of an explanation of how they did on that. In other words, we talked about the meaningfulness of what these scores mean for them. We did the same thing for writing ability. Okay, notice that they're getting a score for communicating your ideas, organizing your ideas, expressing your ideas precisely. And then they got an overall score for that based on the rubric. And then we explained a little bit what that meant. We gave them a score for making your pitch, communicating your ideas, organizing your ideas, expressing your ideas precisely, pitching clearly, okay, persuading the committee, okay, and they just got an overall score for that as well. And then down below, we gave them a much more detailed interpretation of those scores. And then this is the interesting one. We gave them a score for learning, okay, learning about Vietnam and Jordan while taking the test. And notice that this person here, the topical knowledge at the beginning of the test, they got 39% correct. And at the end, they got 83% correct. For us, this is fantastic. And this is the profile that we saw on basically 99% of the people who took the test. They learned something new, okay, on the test. All right, so now that seems okay. How do we do this in our classrooms? So let me just take a test that you might give, and I'm going to take a traditional test you might have, and I'm going to say, well, how can you not have all the bells and whistles that we have on this standardized test, because the standardized test needs the bells and whistles, okay, and they need the research that goes along with it. But how can I make this, how can I make this into my own kind of classroom test? And I'm going to convert one for you. All right. So a test doesn't have to be this complex, right? At the same time, without much difficulty, we can create or adapt tests to be scenario-based and learning-oriented. How do we do that? Okay, here's the context. Imagine you taught a unit on ecosystems in English, okay? The focus was on how different types of human activity can disrupt the ecosystem in a rainforest. So linguistically, you taught the students how to use hypotheticals and other structures to describe the effects on the ecosystem. In your assessment, you decide how to test your students' ability to use these hypotheticals to describe the effects on a different ecosystem from the one that you studied. So this is called transfer of learning, right? That's what we're trying to get at always these tests. Instead of using, the rainforest, now we're going to use marine life, okay? If you're teaching ESP, you recognize this task. If you're teaching CLIL, you recognize this kind of task. We're not inventing anything new here. You recognize these types of tasks. Maybe this next part might be a little bit new, okay? So in the traditional test, there's often no context. There's no reason to communicate other than display your mastery of language. That's very typical for a test, okay? But what you can do is you can change that. In a scenario-based test, you can say, imagine you are asked to write a short article for a high school science newsletter. Now we know the context, we know the real-world competency. It relates to something we do in real life, in which you describe the complexities of a marine ecosystem, okay? You agree, but before doing so, you need to do some research, okay? You see how we're setting it up for building and sharing. In a traditional test, bang, section 1, reading comprehension, read the wetlands passage and write the correct answer, okay? They're given the wetlands passage, and then there are questions. Students answer multiple choice questions designed to measure reading for gist, details, and inferences. Very traditional, old-fashioned, skill-based kind of measurement, which never actually pan out when you do this psychometrically. All right, so how can we change that now? So now, instead of doing that one test, we're going to call this learning about ecosystems. Now, so subtask 1, the instructions are read the passage and answer the multiple choice questions. When finished, you'll receive feedback on your answers. Try to remember the important information so you can write about it in a newsletter. Okay, again, we're keeping that thing. Then they're given the wetlands. So the questions are, students answer the questions designed to measure their ability to understand literal and implied meanings in the text. Now, task number 2 associated with this. Look at the correct answers to this task. Clarify your understandings. If you try to remember the important information for later. So now they're given answers to the passages, and they're asked to remember what they got. They're asked to look at what they got right or wrong, and they're given feedback on it. So this is easy to do in a reading passage online on these types of online tests. But now they're given feedback here. Part 3 of this task is write two important takeaways from the passage to remember that you want to include in your newsletter. Okay, so now each response is scored here for topical accuracy. So did they read it, and were they actually able to write 2 pieces of information about the ecosystems? Okay. All right, let's move on to the next section. On a traditional test, okay, you're gonna say fill in the blank with the correct answer as a grammar section maybe, and so they're going to use a gapped passage maybe, fill in the blanks, and they're going to be 10 pieces of them. So instead of doing that, we can still give them a grammar test in a scenario-based test, but now we're going to call this learning more about ecosystems. Okay, and here you're going to see read the passage. So they're given a passage with blanks, right? Fill in the blanks with the correct forms. It's fine. It's a grammar test. When finished, you'll receive feedback. Again, Try to remember the important information so that you can write about it later in the newsletter. So the passage you give them is still about ecosystems. So they're still learning a little bit more about ecosystems. They're just learning it through a different method. And then students fill in the blanks with the correct structures. Then they're asked to look at the correct answers again, clarify your understandings, and again, try to remember the important information of your newsletter. So all of this is building a mental image of how they're going to be able to write in the end. Part 3 of that task is write one important takeaway from the passage, from this one task. Write one important thing that you learned that you might want to include in your newsletter. And then this response can be scored again for topical accuracy to see if they got it right. Okay, part 3. In a typical test, you would have a traditional test. You would say, look at the graphic of the ecosystem and write a description of the effects of the ecosystem if the heron or whatever bird died out, okay? So the input that they would get is they would see a graphic of an ecosystem, some kind of a graphic there, and then the students would use the graphic in order to write about the effects of the ecosystem if some bird died out, and they would just write the passage. And then this would be scored for topical control, rhetorical control, language control, or however you want to score this. In a scenario-based test, well, now this is the real top. This is the real thing, right? This is where we're going to write the article for a science newsletter. So we've got 2 tasks before that help them prepare it because they're going to have information, right? 2 takeaways from the first piece, 1 takeaway from the second piece. Now it says, look at the graphic of the ecosystem and 3 ideas about what you would like to, what would happen, and 3 ideas about what would happen to the ecosystem if the heron died. So they're going to look at the graphic just like everybody else does, but now they're going to write 3 things about it. They're going to see a graphic of the ecosystem, and this time in the graphic, there will be labels of the vocabulary and things like that. And then they're going to have space to write 3 blank spaces for students to write 3 sentences about the graphic. And again, you can score this for topical accuracy. So now in terms of the content, you've got 2 sentences from the first one, 1 sentence from the second one, 3 sentences from the third one. So you see what I'm saying? We're helping them build a mental image for being able to say something in the last task here. All right, so now the instructions for subtask B here is look at the takeaways from the 2 passages and your ideas about the wetlands ecosystem. All of that is populated here, and it's not hard to do that on the computer. Use this information to write a newsletter article about the wetland system. Remember to include an introduction and a conclusion. You probably I hope you taught that in your class. Use formal scientific language in your article. I hope you taught that in your class. And then they would have a blank here for them to be able to write this. And then we would score this for minimally for topical control, for rhetorical control, and for language control. You can score it for other things if you wanted to as well. So, summarizing all of this. So making the test learning oriented, what have we done? So the contextual dimension is specified in terms of some real world competency like that newsletter. Now what they're doing in class has some kind of resonance with what they need to do outside of class. This is often very motivating for students. The elicitation piece reflects real world complexities. We're not trying to make it easy because everything is not simple. Okay, but we're trying to scaffold it, so we're helping them to meet the complexity. Each component has several carefully sequenced subtasks that build off one another, leading to that narrative goal. Proficiency, we're still trying to get at language here. Okay, we want to see what they know. Okay, it measures their students' ability to use the full linguistic resources to activate, build, consolidate, and share topical information about the test. Students are expected to learn something new here. Okay? This is nothing different from what we do. Okay? We need to acknowledge they're learning something here. There's the instructional dimension and how our choices about how we present this information in the reading and listening, etc. Okay? So this dimension uses the input from the passages to teach examinees about the topic. It uses corrective feedback to teach them about their understandings or misunderstandings. And it uses explicit instruction embedded in the narrative as a design option if you need to give them explicit instruction. If you teach them something, we expect them to learn something. So in the sociocognitive dimension, it's activated by the need to process that information and remember it to a certain extent, so that examinees can use that to write about their responses. This is called situated cognition. It permeates the entire test. And then we need to think about how the students are engaging with this, the affective dimension. So here it's activated. We do this by engineering the test to be interesting, to try to keep it engaging with, we hope that it's going to be engaging with them. And we've been very successful with this based on their responses. In a scenario-based assessment, a lot of this happens within a social interactional dimension. The test the classroom test that I showed you just now does not have this dimension, okay? Because this dimension takes a lot more time and effort, and that's okay. You don't have to have everything in every single test, right? But if you're going to have this if you want to really look at a high stakes test, then you might want to think about putting this dimension in there. But this is a lot of extra work for a classroom test, and honestly, I wouldn't do it. Who's got time to do that? Okay, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Okay, it's there just mentally. Okay. So this dimension represents the characters and their roles in the scenario. It also impacts how we communicate with each other, given our different identities. And then finally, the technological dimension requires examinees to use their digital literacy skills throughout the exam. And importantly, it requires a lot from the test developers, it requires a lot of tech savvy to be able to put the test online, to download score responses. If you have corrective feedback, you need to be able to put the corrective feedback in there. You can do all these with Google Docs, Google Forms. All of this is able to be done easily with Google Forms. And now with the incorporation of AI, we have all of what you're seeing right now is a 2017 version of what we're doing. The 2025 version has, AI. AI can do this. We have programmed AI to just tell us a bunch of scenarios. It will give us a bunch of scenarios. We said to AI, choose this scenario, and then we give them the template for how we've done 2 scenarios before, and we say, and we've taught it actually to create the first version of the scenario-based test. Okay, this has revolutionized our work. Okay, too bad I'm retired. I'm still running the lab, but too bad I'm retired, because I would really go for another grant or another get more money to be able to really develop this. But now this is up to you guys. You're younger than me, and we're always looking for collaborators with our lab. I'm still involved in it, but this is the direction that we've gone in, because we have other tests that we're doing. The C2 test and the A2 test, and we'll do this with that. But we've moved light years ahead of the version you see right now, which was very labor intensive. But now it's like it's night and day. With that, I'm going to just stop, because you're probably sick of listening to me. So I just like to say thank you all for your attention. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, so there you go.
We've got a few questions, so I'm going to read them to you. So the first one is the corrective feedback AI generated?
No, it's not. At this point on this test, it's not. This was, as I say, 2017. This was not AI generated. It was just using Google Forms, that type of thing, where you pre-program the feedback in it. This would be very different now if we were to do it with AI. Okay, but what you saw there is just that first piece.
Yeah. Okay, so sometimes it's very demanding having the 7 criteria for speaking. Yes, that's very demanding. Yeah, that very demanding task. Okay, question number 2. Could you explain how the speaking is assessed, please? Is this done online, as in the example you provided before the conference? How is this performance practically assessed?
Okay, so that's a good question. So yes, it's all done online. There's a point there in this, because the whole test is online, right? And there's a point in the test where they click, and before they get to the test, first of all, they need to test their computers and all that stuff to see if you got the good voice quality and all that stuff. Okay, so in terms of digital literacy, we try to take care of that before the test. Okay, then they get into the test, they go through the scenario, and now they're at the point where they work with the group and they say, okay, I as the examinee need to represent the group and make my pitch on behalf of the group. So what they do is there's a button, you push the button, and it will tell you, and you can actually record it. We're not recording video because at the time we did this, it cost way too much money to record the video. But we record the audio, and then after they do the audio, then they're able to listen to it again and see if it was a good sample. If it was a good sample, they hit submit. If it was not a good sample, then they hit re-record. Okay, and not so many people are re-recording. Okay, they're just it's a pretty good quality of the sample, and then they hit submit. That goes to a place on the internet, in that magical world up there. It goes to a place, and then we, as test developers, we take those samples, and then we put them in files, and then there's a whole system for how to give those files to raters to score. Okay, all right. So that's the one piece. So it's organized by us, and then the rubric itself is also online. So you get the speaking test, there are 7 rubrics or 6 rubrics. So basically what happens is you go into the website, you see there's an introduction. First of all, you're trained to do this. There's an online training piece, and there's an in-person training piece. So they do the first piece online, and then they come in there, the rater gets in there, and they sit there and they go online. They see that they have to do 6 or 7, 10 ratings, okay? And they'll see links. They're links, basically, okay? So link number 1 will come up. You'll press link number 1, and then that will take them to, you'll see link number 1, and then you'll see 7 rubrics there, okay? You'll see rubric 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you click rubric 1, and as soon as you click rubric 1, actually, it's going to then, so all of this is together. So they click rubric 1, they listen to the sample, they click the box on the rubric that it's applied to. They go to rubric 2. If they want to listen again, they can. And then they click the box. They go to next. They click the box. They go to next. And then maybe they forgot the sample or they need to re-listen to the sample for the language piece. They listen to the sample again. They click the box, click next, and they get to the very end of that. And then they click submit. And all of that goes to an Excel sheet that's associated with task 1, 2, 3 through 7. Okay. And then after that, we have automated the analyses, so that you can program this in there so that it automatically gives you certain types of statistics associated with this whole thing. And that whole piece there is fascinating. It's I love that piece, but it's a different talk. Does that answer your question? Whoever answered this question? Whoever asked this question?
Well, that's the beauty of computers, right? I hope, yes, because that's the question which I took from the chat. So if it wasn't, then the author of the question would have probably spoken up. So question number 3 then. Any hints on using scenario-based language assessment in mass language proficiency testing? That is the question.
To scale, standardized, large scale tests.
Large scale, I think so. Large scale testing.
We have done that. So we basically, all of this is online. And so we've collected data in Vietnam, in the Middle East. We've collected data all over the place. And basically what we do, we set it up. So if everybody's in the same time zone, if you're all in France, okay, then it's really very easy. It's very easy to do. It's not easy to do when you're in different time zones. Okay, that is quite a challenge. But if you're in the same time zone, basically they have between X time and Y time to do the test, and then they go online. It depends on whether they're doing a secure test or not a secure test. If they're doing a secure test, it's more complex in the beginning because they need to go to a website and that's all within the Columbia network, and it's really secure, so they can't do X, Y, and Z with the computer. It locks it all down. So if it's secure, then that's a different topic again. And but just normal classroom stuff where you don't really need secure stuff quite so much. They go there and they take the test, and everybody takes it together. Okay. And they do it at their own pace. They have 2 hours to do it, 2.5 hours to do it. And it just collects the data. Okay. We've given it to 150 people at a time. Yeah. So, I mean, that's not like, Cambridge's test where they're giving it to 20,000 or ETS where they're giving it to many, many people like that. We're a research lab. Okay.
Oh, yeah, there are certain
Cambridge's money or ETS's money, then we might be able to have the resources to be able to do that. But, right now we're a research lab, but we're able to give it to pretty many people. Okay. Yeah. And there are some snags. So just related to that question, there are some snags that we've had where people have lost the internet, and then we've had to deal with that. They can, so we have people standing by while they're online, while they're taking the test, so that if something happens, it goes wrong, then they email, they go to this other site and they talk to a person who can help them. And then if they have to do it over again, or a section of a test over again, we let them do it over again. Obviously, I mean, it's this will happen in all tests that I know of. This will happen. We try to pretend it doesn't, but it does happen in any kind of computer delivered test. And we've had our growing pains with that. But the majority of them, it's been fine.
Yeah.
One example that we had that was not pretty was we allowed language teachers like you guys. We experimented with language teachers, and we said, look, guys, this is like, we just need your help to do this. And can you please take the test, do it seriously as if you're a language learner, blah, blah, blah. And half of them cheated. Half of them went to the internet and put in AI and got the responses from AI. And of course, we have techniques to be able to detect that. But it was a lot of work to be able to detect all that cheating. But they went off to AI. They were going to be savvier than you. And so we basically busted them all. Okay. And says, you don't get a score for this because you cheated. We didn't say it in those words because, we're polite and nice and, all that stuff, our colleagues, but they cheated. So that was a lesson to us,
That's how we learn on our mistakes.
Yeah, we learned the hard way on that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. The next question is related to that. That is, how do you monitor the use of AI by students throughout the different tasks?
Yeah. So if you're doing a secure test, okay, we have it locked down. We pay money, and it's like $5 an examinee. It's a Columbia thing. And so we pay money to lock it down. You get into a screen and you are locked. You can't go anywhere outside of that. Not anywhere. Okay. So that's one thing. And you have to agree to a video. And I know that's not nice, but you have to agree to a video, or you go to a testing a center where it's controlled. Okay. And we've done this. Also, in this video, AI is watching you. And if there's any kind of weirdness with AI, so for example, if you see somebody doing this, AI will give you a warning. Okay. Please keep your eye on the screen, that kind of thing. If you do that too often, if it detects it too often, it'll shut you out of the test. You're busted. Okay. So there's no playing around with any of that stuff. If someone else comes into the screen behind that, AI can detect that immediately. And so, if it's a high stakes test, that we can't really allow people to, people will always cheat, right? They will always cheat. I might look at this, but AI can detect even eye movement now. It's crazy. It's scary, actually. I'm glad I'm retiring. But in any case, yeah, but so that's how, we've tried to manage that for the high stakes test. When we gave it to our students in the community language program at Teachers College, which was that was high stakes. And so we're talking about placement test scores. We used this, and at the time we thought that they would really be angry about the videoing them and stuff like that. This was during the pandemic. Nobody really complained about it, about videoing them and stuff like that. They just knew it was a test and they had to do this. Okay. I mean, the alternative was don't take the test and fail, or don't come to the program. Actually, don't come to the program. And I had to write something in the IRB stuff because we were collecting data. I kept saying, if this is not for you, then maybe this program is not for you, because one of the things we do with our program, our language program, is research, and you need to agree to research. If you don't agree to doing the research, fine, I respect that. Go to a different language program. Ours is very cheap, and so it just comes with a condition.
And by the way, AI has just written on my screen that it's writing the transcription of your talk. But I didn't press OK. I didn't. Yes, but it's trying to spy on us. Okay.
I just hate it. I just hate it. It's everywhere. It's just, stop it. Anyway, never mind. I won't laugh on that.
Okay. We've got one more, the last question. Do you know how long on average for examiners to mark? Do you know how long on average it takes, I think, for the examiners to mark the speaking test?
I don't have that number in my head, but we have all that information. Okay. We have all the information. So all of the stuff that you've seen today we have not been concerned about time. And the reason is because we've done the exam and it's all developmental. Okay. So we needed to do this so that we were able to revise it, so we were able to experience it ourselves in terms of the scoring and all that stuff. And so most of the people in the lab who've worked on the scoring, we don't really have good information on how long it took them to do it. Okay. But in the last 2 administrations, we asked other people who were not our people in our lab to join and to do that. And I don't have the information on right now, but we have the analytics that relate to that. As far as I know, is no one complained. Okay. No teachers complained about how long it took them to do it. Again, we were paying them a very small amount of money to do this, and we also wanted them to give us feedback on how to improve the rubrics. So we don't have really good information, but we do have the analytics online of how much time they were spending on every part of the rubric. Okay. Yeah. From my own experience of doing it, in the norming session that we put together, it really that's where the hard work is. It's a lot of people have a hard time, like, what is the topical stuff? They're not usually scoring for topic. A lot of people might have hard work with the with persuasiveness. What does that actually mean, persuasiveness? And so we have to work with people on, what is persuasive language? Because it's very a gestalt. So they've had problems with that. They have had no problems with language, fluency, intonation, organization. The stuff that we normally score for, they had no problems with. And so that goes pretty fast. The other parts, the content part was a little bit trickier. They're not used to scoring for that. And the persuasive part was tricky. But as I say, people did it, and I got no complaints. Nobody revolted. So I think they were amazed that they didn't have to have 3 pieces of paper together to do this. And then
I think that this actually works.
Put it in the Excel sheet and all that, because they saved a lot of time with that. And they loved just clicking on the rubric. Yeah. And clicking on the link, either the link was through the writing or the speaking, they just have it all right there in front of them. It's kind of like when you vet a paper online. I don't know whether you've ever vetted an abstract online. It's all right there. So it really helps you get it done efficiently. Okay.
Yeah, right. That certainly helps, and no calculating, no
Right.
calculations. Yeah, so it's
Exactly.
quicker in this way. Yes, right. Okay, we've got one more question.
Okay.
Christina asks to ask the question to you, and this is how it goes. Would this still work if we ask students to apply critical thinking about the texts and videos they read and watch as part of this task?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So they're actually providing critical thinking anyway. You're just not getting data on it. Okay, right? When you ask them to think about, when you ask them to read something and categorize it, that's critical thinking. If you ask them to read something and categorize it so that they have to write about it, all of that is critical thinking. Now, in our test in the experimental stage, once we asked them to do that, we asked them to actually report on that. Okay, we just said, tell us about whether we just had a couple questions to get at that critical thinking question here. Are they doing the things mentally that we expected them to do? Okay, and so we got information on that. But absolutely, this is the great thing about a scenario. You can dream up. So the guide, the teacher could say, they could stop the scenario and say, I just have a question. I'd like to ask you just about what process you're using in order to do that. Could you just write a response on that? I'd be really curious to hear about that. Teachers do this all the time in real life, right? So what that means for you is you just set up a different task and then ask them to do it. Either now you could ask them to do it through speaking, or I wouldn't do that, although you can get transcripts. Or you have them write about it. And it's very easy to collect data like that online now. But you can engineer anything into the scenario. Anything. That's what's so beautiful about it. Okay.
Yes, that's great. Yes, that's all depends on the so-called construct. Yes, what we want to measure. Yeah.
Depends on what you want to get at. So that critical thinking piece is a performance moderator. Because the idea is if your critical thinking is right on task, if it's sufficient, then it's going to improve your performance, right? It's going to moderate your performance. So the whole reason why we're using learning-oriented assessment is because your performance is just one dimension of it, but there are other dimensions that moderate the performance, either make it better or worse, right? So if you report that, it's too hard, you just can't, you're just overwhelmed, you can't do that. And we've had some people say that, okay? And their scores were low. Guess what? Or they just ran out of energy, or better, when we had a couple of people say, this test is just too long, I just don't have the attention span to do it. That's what they're basically saying, okay? And they pulled out, and that's fine. If it were a real test, you get a low placement, or you wouldn't be able to get, you wouldn't be able to get a grade. But this is, we have volunteers doing this, but that was good information for us, because there are people who check out. They don't have the dispositional, the behavioral disposition, effort, persistence to follow the test through. Okay. For me as a teacher, this gives me a lot of information. Gives me super information. They don't have the grit to succeed. Okay. Think about this. Everything is not easy we do. We've spent a lot of time where we really don't want to do it, but we just have to do it. And it's called effort and persistence, and even when it's hard. Okay. So for me as a teacher, no learning is going to happen if a student has a hard time with this piece. So I need to deal with that first. Okay. and I need to, get them over that. And then once they're available for learning, then that's a different topic here. But you're not going to learn if people don't have that type of disposition. So as I say, that effective dimension is super important, and we engineered that into the test. Okay. Good question.
Yeah. So I've got one more question, if you can,
No
from
problem.
Cesare. I think it's quite important, by the way, is if there is time for one more question, here we have. Can students take notes during the test?
Yes, they can.
Yeah.
The notes, they can take notes during the test. If you're in the actual place, you can take notes on a paper, okay? And I think at one point, so in the beginning, they took notes on paper, and then we took the notes when they left. Okay. At one point also, they were allowed to take notes online. Okay. And I think we got rid of that. I'm not sure whether we got rid of it or not, but we did have a piece in there where they're allowed to take notes online, and then the notes carried over from piece to piece. The notes from here got put over here. Okay. We might have gotten rid of that, but this has been through multiple versions. But if we got rid of it, it's because the notes weren't really they were more trouble than what they were worth. But yeah, so I know where this question is coming from, Cesare. It's how do I remember all this stuff? Okay, if you're giving me reading stuff, and you're giving me listening stuff, how do I remember that stuff? And this is not a memory test. It's not designed as a memory test. So what we've done in the test is we've continually provided them with support, with topical supports. You have the list of pros and cons. Okay, you have the list. So you have all these lists here that are continually trying to, have people have this not be a memory test, but having those notes jog your memory for what you read about or listened to. Okay, so this has been thought through that we do not want this to be a memory test, but to some extent it has to be. Memory is engaged because you've read something, you've thought about it, you've listened to something, you've thought about it, and you've built that mental image in your head in order to be able to write about it. Okay.
But that's very useful when you can take notes. Yes, right. In such situations, for many students, it is very useful, and they are used to that. Well, Jim, thank you very much. It was a very interesting, it was a great presentation, very inspiring, and I'm sure that many of us will use the ideas that you presented to look into our tests, exams, and into our teaching and make changes. Yes, so thank you very much for.
Let me just say one more thing here. It's like I just want everybody to know that this research we've been doing this since about 2012, 2013. And I mean, Laurent knows this because we worked with them a lot at one point. And so right now, all these years, we've really had partnered with many people from around the world to be able to give this test in other languages. So we have an Italian SBA, we have an Arabic SBA, we have a Farsi SBA, we have a Korean SBA. Our donor, no, we don't have a Spanish or a French SBA because our donor wanted us to do languages that were other than the common languages. Okay, we were able to get the Italian in there because I used it I'm Italian, so I had to put that in there whether they liked it or not. I just had to do that. And so this research is now being published. Okay, it's being written up. Many papers have been accepted in the vol. The issue will be in Language Assessment Quarterly, probably at the end of the year. Hopefully at the end of the year. It must be at the end of the year. So there are like 9 or 10 papers in there that introduces you to SBA, then introduces you to this talk I gave you today. There is an empirical paper on does this stuff actually work psychometrically. There's a paper on whether this is done. What are the students' reactions to all this stuff? And there's the Italian paper. There's the Korean paper. There's a paper on cognition, on what is happening cognitively in not this exam, but there's a different SBA. So there are other types of SBAs as well. And then there's a paper on technology, and then there's a commentary. Very famous people in SBA are writing a commentary on the entire collection. So this is something to look forward to a little bit later. So you don't have to have all right now, but you'll have a lot to talk about maybe next year at this time. Okay, so I want to just thank everybody. Thank you guys for coming, for sticking through this whole time. I don't know how many participants are left, but this is quite a commitment, and thank you guys for organizing it.
Thank you. Once again, thank you.
Okay. Thanks to you, dear Jim. It really was a pleasure to listen to that talk. I'm always absolutely in awe about the span that you cover from let's say, theory, epistemology, to class activity, practice, etc. And this is exactly what we defend, plus the plurilingual perspective, which is the DNA of CercleS. We share
Exactly. My
so
DNA
many
too.
languages in Europe, as you know, and this is all so inspiring. And just perhaps to let the participants know that this talk will be uploaded on the CercleS YouTube channel, and you people will be able to, of course, come back to the talk when you like, and share this moment again with Jim. And thank you again. It was just so inspiring.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys. I'm coming back to the reality here now in New York City. I'll talk to you guys later.
Thank you very much. Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Once again, thank you very much. It was great.
Bye-bye.